Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Solo Spooky Story. My name is Rob, and today I'll be your host. For those of you that don't know, the Solo Spooky Stories are shorter episodes hosted by myself every other week where I'll talk about something that I just find particularly interesting, or, we have a listener submission that, we decided to talk about, or it's just something that could have, been interesting to myself or Suze, but there's just not enough in it for a full episode. And we decided to just, have a one-on-one instead, and as I've said before, people enjoy these, and I actually really enjoy them too. They're a very different format to the usual podcast episodes, and they're just enjoyable. Yeah, they're just fun to do, so we'll keep them going as long as everyone's still interested in them. We'll still keep these going. But with that said, I hope whenever it is you're listening to this, you're having a lovely day. I personally enjoy listening to shorter podcast episodes myself in the morning whenever I have some time to myself. Listen to it in the morning, cup of coffee, cup of tea, perfect. A good 10-15 minute episode, can't beat it. So yeah, hope whenever it is you're listening to this, you're enjoying yourself, and you're looking forward to another little bite-sized piece of the paranormal. And with that said, I am going to talk about something that I absolutely love today. We've just had St. Patrick's Day. We've had, all the kind of celebrations that go with that. We've had Seacht na Gaeilge, which is the Irish celebration, 2 weeks of Irish language and all that. And, you kind of just hear about all these great things in, Irish folklore, Irish stories, all the kind of the cool things that you're taught as kids. You're reminded of it this time of the year in kind of mid-March. And yeah, you learn all these things in school and you kind of forget about them. And I was thinking today about, St. Patrick's Day and how there's loads of lore and mythology obviously around himself, the whole thing with the snakes and driving them all away and pagans and all that sort of stuff. And it's just kind of just cool stories that you learn as kids in Ireland. You don't really kind of engage with them after school. So one thing that I was thinking about today, which is particularly appropriate for this podcast, particularly with our logo in mind, is the lore and the stories of the Púca. So the Púca in Ireland is a big deal. The Púca is basically it's the OG fairy / trickster / ghost and goblin and kind of everything in between. And the thing that I love about the Púca is that it's just this really cool legendary creature from Irish folklore that can kind of be whatever you want it to be. And it's one of these kind of explainer kind of boilerplate explanations for the paranormal. You'll even hear now older people in Ireland talking about the Púca, talking about fairies, talking about the little people and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, the Púca is very much so a real thing for people of, I suppose, a certain generation or certain beliefs in Ireland. And I going into kind of the Celtic regions as well, kind of Wales and Scotland as well. It is very much so a piece of the lore and mythology in this part of the world. So the word Púca comes from the Old Irish word púcán, which means goblin or spirit. I have learned it as spirit, but I did see some people online say that it also would be fitting to call it goblin. I'm not so sure about that, but it's okay. We'll give it both. So, but in school you would learn about it as a spirit or a ghost. And as everyone is aware from this podcast, our logo is two ghosts talking to each other over a microphone that my wife very kindly made for us. And I remember saying to Suze at the time when we made it that it looks like kind of two Púca kind of talking to each other. So I love that. So yeah, so just as I said, been thinking about it and thought, you know what, let's make an episode on it. So the Púca is this, I suppose you could call it a spirit, or in some kind of lore, it's also described as a shapeshifter. And it kind of takes on these various forms, such as, horses, goats, rabbits, dogs. And it's one of those things in Irish literature that there's a lot of shapeshifters. There's a lot of fairies and things like that turn into different creatures. There's the changeling, which is supposedly the elves that have replaced kids or people and all that sort of stuff. And obviously the werewolves of Ossory as well. There's a lot of shapeshifters in Irish mythology, and it's a really interesting, I suppose, concept. I suppose it kind of explains how people thought about things and shows you how they thought about things in the past. And the Púca's no different. So as I said, it has all these various different animals that it represents. But I suppose its most iconic form, and I suppose stories that I would have heard as a kid, is that of it being a jet black horse. And it's got these glowing eyes that I once heard described as beautiful and eerie all at once. And yeah, the Púca itself, its nature is generally quite playful. Sometimes it's quite mischievous. And there's even been other stories of it being quite kind or even helpful at certain points. And I suppose it's the unpredictability about this spirit makes it one of Irish folklore's most fascinating figures. And a story that I'd heard before in the past, and I didn't really kind of remember most of it, so I looked it up, is the story of the bewitched horseman. And this is a really interesting story for me because I remember hearing it as a child, and it made me think of the Headless Horseman, which everyone knows the story of the Headless Horseman at this point, but it kind of, I hold it in that same sort of category, I suppose, as the Headless Horseman, and it was something that's always just been in the back of my mind. And as I looked it up, I was kind of enjoying reading about it. So the bewitched horseman is the story of the Púca that I've chosen to share today. There are hundreds of stories of the Púca, and I could literally do a whole series on Púca stories, which, you know, if anyone is interested, I'm more than happy to do that. But yeah, the story that I chose today is the bewitched horseman. So the story goes that there was a bunch of farmers who in an area of Ireland claimed to encounter this mischievous spirit fairly frequently, especially during the dark and on moonlit nights. And this story goes on to talk about a young farmer who is obviously nameless because he doesn't need to have a name. He's returning home late one evening, and he had been celebrating the festival. Samhain is what I heard. So he's celebrating Samhain, he's enjoying himself, you know, he's getting into the festivities and all this. And as I would assume at this point, alcohol most likely was involved. Let's just cover that now. So he probably was drinking a little bit. And as the festivity started to wind down, he decided to return home. And the path that he was walking on wound through these desolate hills where the Púca was said to, I suppose, haunt or roam or you know, linger in. And as the farmer walked, he heard the sound of galloping hooves behind him. And, you know, I would assume at this point he probably just assumed that it was another person returning home from the festival, and he didn't really think anything of it. But as the hooves came closer to him, he turned around, obviously expecting to see another traveler going past him. And turning around, he saw this massive black horse with eyes that were glowing in the dark. And I always heard them described as glowing like embers. So it's that kind of like reddish orange color, like glowing in the darkness. So, you know, anyone who's ever played the video game Skyrim, I'm thinking of the black horse with red eyes right now. That's exactly the image that I have in my head. And, you know, I'm sure that's exactly what this guy was seeing. Or, you know, one of the like Ringwraith's horses from Lord of the Rings. It's something like that just kind of like terrifying, like big looming black horse with glowing eyes coming at you in the dark. So the horse, being this kind of like sleek but powerful creature, approached him, and as it got closer to him, it actually knelt, as if basically inviting him to climb onto its back. So the farmer, obviously delighted with himself, you know, after having a few drinks, all of a sudden is getting offered a lift back from a horse, decides, I must be getting offered a shortcut. And I suppose the best way to put it is he's probably emboldened by the festivities. He decides to go, do you know what, I'm gonna get on this horse. So he hops up on the horse, and as he settled into the saddle, the horse itself let out this wild neigh and took off at an impossible speed. And as the horse starts running, he starts to hear it laughing. So it's not neighing anymore. This creature's actually laughing, like cackling, and it's letting out this cackle as it's running. So the horse proceeds to leap over fences, it jumps over rivers, gallops across the countryside, basically carrying the farmer quite a distance and leaping quite a bit. And it's, you know, moving so fast that the farmer's basically like clinging onto it for dear life. You know, his initial excitement, I'm sure, that he had at the thought of being a free lift home has now been replaced with sheer terror. The ride goes on for an indeterminate amount of time, with the horse twisting and turning and the cackling laughter coming out of it echoing into the night. And what I heard is that basically the horse ran for the entire night. It didn't stop until dawn began to break, at which point the horse came to a sudden stop and threw the farmer off its back into a muddy ditch. So when the farmer scrambled to his feet, he found himself far from home in an unfamiliar field. And what was even stranger was the horse was gone, but he could still hear the cackling echoing on the wind. So the farmer, I suppose, being shaken but ultimately unharmed by all of this, tried to make his way back home, vowing at this point that he was never going to ride a horse again. And I suppose when he eventually got back to his home, bear in mind that his horse was galloping all night, so it must have taken him quite a while to get home. He eventually gets home and he tells the locals about what had happened. And when the locals hear about all of this, they tell him that he encountered the Púca, and that basically, according to their local lore, this is one of its favorite tricks to play on the innocent people, basically, of the town. So I just love that story. I think it's a cool, just, you know, fun story. I'm sure there's a meaning to it, but I don't know what it is. Maybe it's, you know, don't take a free lift after you've had a few drinks, potentially. We're all guilty of that, I'm sure, at some point. But, you know, to me, that's an absolute beacon of hope. Like, if you're stumbling home after a few drinks and someone offers you a lift, like, unfortunately, you are going to take it, you know? So it's a fun story, though. I do really enjoy it. And it's as I said, it's one of those stories that just stuck out to me in my head as the, you know, the story about the Púca that I first heard, I suppose. So I suppose beyond the black horse form, as I said, the Púca's also appeared as a goat. It's appeared as a rabbit or a hare, or even a ghostly figure. And it really just seems to kind of adapt its form to suit its purposes, I suppose. That's the best way to put it. That, you know, if it wants to look like an animal, it will. Or if it wants to look like a Victorian era ghost to haunt you, it will also do that. It's very adaptable, I suppose, to its climate. And yeah, the whole thing is that it's this kind of trickster spirit. It will lure kind of travelers into dangerous or confusing situations. It also spoils blackberries after Samhain, which is just inexcusable. I can't get on board with that. It's not cool at all. Or it'll lead people astray on misty paths and things like that. So its mischief is generally, I suppose, quite harmless, but it can be unsettling enough to leave an impression on people. And I suppose the story of spoiling blackberries could potentially come as just a warning to kids to just not pick overripe blackberries, as, you know, they're going out to do these things would have made them sick. So they were maybe warned about this to maybe think that they were touched by the Púca or something, and not touch blackberries after Samhain, which is in October. So yeah, as I said, the Púca is kind of, it's got this connection to Samhain, to Irish folklore, but Samhain in particular, which is that ancient Celtic festival marking the transition from harvest season into winter. And as I've said before, when talking about Samhain, this is kind of the time where the veil between the natural and the supernatural worlds was said to be at its thinnest, and it allowed creatures like the Púca greater freedom to roam the land and the countryside. And I suppose building on the whole kind of harvest festival and all that, in some tales the Púca is this kind of benevolent creature that ensures farmers have a bountiful harvest if they treat him with respect, and in others it's this kind of trickster that spoils crops or scares farmers who neglect their duties. So I suppose it serves as kind of a warning to farmers to do their jobs, basically. So it's this really just cool trickster spirit. And yeah, the Púca's had a fairly kind of big influence on literature and pop culture. So I think probably the most famous example of Púca is it's allegedly inspired the character of Puck in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. So, you know, it's very much so been around for quite a long time, and it's that kind of mischievous trickster that we all love. But yeah, it's one of these stories that's still very much so in Irish folklore, and it continues to be passed down through generations. You know, you'll still hear stories of the Púca. There's a whole festival called Púca Festival now that runs every year in the town that I live in, and it's this kind of cool pagan festival, I suppose is what you could call it, which is celebrated every year in October. It's coming up to Samhain and all that. I talked about it last year when it happened. It's an amazing festival. There's so much culture to it. There's so much history. You get to hear about all the kind of like the ancient ways that Samhain was celebrated, and, you know, Púca is the name of the festival now, and I think it's really appropriate for that. But yeah, it's one of these myths, creatures, whatever you want to call it, that continues to have this role as a symbol of the mysterious and the unpredictable in Irish folklore. And I suppose it's got that timeless appeal as a creature that kind of balances between being helpful, harmful, or charmful and chilling. And yeah, it's just this cool creature that I just wanted to talk about today. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Púca. Like, there's so many other stories of Irish folklore that have the Púca mentioned in it. And as I said, I could literally do a full series on just stories about the Púca. Like, there's that many of them. They're brilliant stories, and they're really interesting. And everyone has heard a different story as a child, or you hear a story in a pub, or you hear a story from grandparents or whatever. Like, there are many stories of the Púca. But yeah, I'd love to hear your own stories on this, or if you're interested in hearing more stories about the Púca, please do let me know. You can reach out to us on Instagram at the Spooky AF Pod. Same with Threads. We're also on YouTube at the Spooky AF Podcast, or you can email us at the spookyafpodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your submissions on stories with the Púca, or as I said, if there's specific stories of the Púca you'd like to hear, you can let me know, and I'll look into them and for sure read them out. But with that said, I hope you're having a lovely day whenever it is you're listening to this, and we'll catch you in the next one. Take it easy, guys.